Out. Victor Hale had never asked anyone for anything he couldn't repay. At 41, he worked the overnight shift at a private parking structure in downtown Cincinnati, knew every crack in the concrete of every level, and came home each morning in time to make his daughter breakfast before she left for school. He was, by most visible measures, a man who had made peace with small things. He did not complain. He did not explain himself. Out. He had a daughter named Iris who was 7 years old and who drew horses on everything, and he had a routine that ran like a clock set to his life's specific requirements. That was enough. He told himself that was enough. Out. What he did not have was a plan for the morning a woman in a black coat showed up at his door and changed the definition of enough entirely. Out. What would you do if the person you had spent years dismissing turned out to be the only one steady enough to hold what you were about to drop? Out. Renata Solano had built her reputation on speed. At 44, she was the managing partner of Solano Strategic Consulting, a firm she had grown from a two-person operation in a borrowed office to a company of 31 people with clients in 6 states. She did not take vacations. She did not slow down for traffic, for weather, or for the opinions of people who had not earned the right to have them. She wore structured black coats and carried everything she needed in one bag. Out. Her employees knew better than to stand in the threshold of her office door. Either you were in the room or you were not. Out. She had 2 ex-husbands and no interest in a third. The first marriage had lasted 4 years and taught her that a charming man with good references could still be a disaster inside the house. The second had lasted 6 years and produced a lesson so expensive that she had rewritten her entire approach to personal trust from the ground up. She had loved both men, which she considered the only honest explanation for why the damage had been so thorough. Out. When the second divorce was finalized, she sat alone in her car in the parking lot of her attorney's office for 11 minutes, and then she drove to work. She had a proposal due in 48 hours. She did not miss the deadline. Out. By 44, she was the most capable person in almost any room she entered, and the least comfortable person in any room where someone asked her about herself. She had arranged her life to minimize the frequency of those rooms. Out. Her father, Edward Solano, had been watching this arrangement for 15 years. Edward was 70 years old, recently widowed, and still sharp in the specific way of men who have spent decades paying attention to things others preferred not to see. He had spent 30 years as a civil engineer and had learned to identify the structural conditions that preceded failure before the visible signs appeared. He applied this skill with varying degrees of success to his daughter. Out. He presented his concern on a Sunday in March over lunch at the kitchen table of the house Renata had grown up in. The concern arrived in the form of a manila envelope. Out. The envelope contained documentation. A former client of Solano Strategic, a real estate developer named Frank Brower, had spent the past 7 months in an escalating pattern of behavior that Edward's private attorney had flagged as harassment adjacent. The emails had started professionally hostile and had moved through several gradations since then. Brower had lost a significant contract when Renata's analysis had recommended against his bid for a city redevelopment project. Out. He blamed her directly. He had said so in writing to her, to 2 of her current clients, and to a local business publication that had declined to print it. He had also, in the past 6 weeks, hired a firm that specialized in something described in the documentation as competitive intelligence. Out. Renata read through the envelope without changing her expression. She set it on the table and poured herself more coffee. Out. She did not need a watchdog, she told her father. She had an attorney. She had a building with a security desk and key card access. Frank Brower was a blustering man who had made a bad bet and was looking for someone to blame, and she had dealt with far worse than bruised egos in the past 20 years of business. Out. Edward was quiet for a moment, then he told her that he had already made an arrangement. A man named Thomas Waverly would be moving into the guest unit above Edward's garage, which was connected by a covered walkway to the side entrance of Renata's home office. The office was attached to her house. The arrangement was temporary. 2 weeks minimum, then they would reassess. Out. Renata set down her coffee cup. Out. She told her father precisely what she thought of this. She was organized and specific about it. Edward listened to all of it with the patience of a man who had heard his daughter be organized and specific about things before, and had learned to wait until she was finished. Out. When she finished, he slid a second sheet across the table. It was a printout of a photograph, security camera quality, showing a man outside the parking lot behind her office building 2 Tuesdays in a row, always after dark, always facing her building's rear entrance. Out. She looked at it for a long moment. Out. She did not say yes, but she did not say the final no that would have ended the conversation, and her father knew the difference. Out. Thomas Waverly arrived on a Wednesday evening in a truck that needed new shocks. He was 39 years old, 6 feet of not particularly remarkable height, with a steady way of moving that suggested neither hurry nor hesitation. He had a daughter named Cora who was 8 years old and who sat in the passenger seat of the truck reading a paperback book with a flashlight even though the parking area was lit. He had one toolbox, one military-issue duffel bag, and a folded quilt that had clearly been washed many times. Renata watched him from the window of her home office for approximately 10 seconds before going back to her screen. She sent her father a text message that said simply 2 weeks. The rules she established the following morning were not delivered as rules. They were delivered as a briefing, because briefings were more efficient and less open to interpretation. Thomas Waverly listened to the full briefing without interrupting. He was sitting at the small table in the walkway kitchen when she found him, drinking coffee that he had made himself in the guest unit and brought over in a thermos, which she had not anticipated and which she chose not to address. He listened. When she finished, he said, "Understood." That was all. She went back to her office and spent the next 20 minutes reviewing a client proposal and not thinking about the fact that she had genuinely expected at least some negotiation. The first 3 days were frictionless in the specific way that creates its own kind of friction. Thomas Waverly did not intrude. He kept Cora quiet during Renata's working hours, which she had specified and which he honored to the minute. He made no requests. He asked for nothing. He was simply present in the peripheral way of furniture, except that furniture did not check sight lines from the guest unit window or note the arrival time of vehicles on the street below. Renata noticed the sightline thing on the second day. She noticed it the way she noticed most details she wasn't looking for, by its absence. He was not at the window the way an anxious or bored person would be at a window. He was at it the way someone checks a gauge, briefly, completely, and then gone. She noted it and said nothing. On the fourth morning, she came into the walkway kitchen for her second coffee of the day and found Cora sitting at the table with her book and a bowl of cereal. The girl looked up with the careful, evaluating expression of a child who has learned that adults operate at different temperatures and that it is wise to take the temperature first. Renata acknowledged her with a nod, the neutral one she used in conference rooms when she was listening but had not yet formed a position. She poured her coffee. After a moment, Cora said, "Your bird feeder is empty." Renata looked out the kitchen window. There was indeed a bird feeder. She had installed it 2 springs ago during a brief and uncharacteristic weekend project and had refilled it twice before forgetting it existed. "I'll get to it," Renata said. Cora returned to her book. The interaction lasted 40 seconds, and Renata thought about it twice during her afternoon calls, which was 45 seconds more than she had planned to allocate. Thomas Waverly came to her that evening with a jar of sunflower seeds he had apparently purchased at some point during the day. He set it on the counter without comment. Renata looked at the jar. She looked at him. He had already turned back toward the walkway door. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He paused. "I know," he said. Cora noticed the feeder. He went back to the guest unit. Renata filled the feeder. She did not examine why she did it immediately rather than waiting until the weekend. The friction between them when it came was not dramatic. It arrived on day 6 in the form of Renata coming home from a client dinner to find that Thomas had rearranged the chairs on her back patio. She stood in the doorway to the patio for a long moment, trying to identify what had changed. The chairs were in essentially the same positions, but not quite. 2 had shifted approximately 8 inches toward the center. The small table had moved slightly left. She went back inside without asking about it. She stood in her kitchen and thought about sight lines. From the new arrangement, anyone sitting on the patio was no longer visible from the gap between the back fence posts. She had not known that gap existed until she thought about what the new arrangement implied. She made herself a glass of water and went back to work. On day 8, Thomas drove her to a meeting across town because her car was in for service and she had been planning to take a rideshare. He said nothing about this being a change in their arrangement. He simply offered and she accepted because it was logistically cleaner. He took a route she would not have chosen. The meeting was at a hotel on the east side. He took surface streets in a pattern that seemed at first like an unusual preference and then seemed like something else. That's not the direct route, she said. There's a car, he said, dark gray mid-size sedan. It's been behind us since your street. She looked at the mirror. She saw nothing she could interpret. You're certain? He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. He made 4 turns in a pattern that was too deliberate to be navigation. By the time they reached the main avenue, whatever he had been watching was no longer visible. He delivered her to the hotel entrance with 3 minutes to spare. Out. She sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Out. Where did you learn to drive like that? She said. Out. It wasn't really a question about driving, and he knew it. He looked straight ahead. Out. Long time ago, he said. Different job. Out. She got out of the car and walked into the meeting and spent the first 7 minutes of a 40-minute presentation thinking about what different job meant from a man whose official file described him as a property security consultant. Out. She began paying closer attention. Out. She was a woman who processed information for a living, and Thomas Waverly had become a data problem she could not set aside. She began organizing what she had. He drove like someone trained in surveillance detection. He read spaces the way her firm's former security consultant had read them, a man who had spent 12 years with a federal protective detail. His file said property security. The gap between those two things was too wide to be explained by career drift. Out. His hands were the kind that came from working with specific tools for a long time. Not construction, not mechanics, but something else. She noticed this while watching him help Cora with a puzzle on the guest unit porch. The hands were precise, the movements were economical in the specific way of people trained to perform tasks under conditions where excess motion was a liability. Out. She asked him about his background on a Thursday evening, standing in the walkway kitchen while Cora watched something on a tablet in the other room. Out. You were in the military, she said. It was not a question. Out. Long time ago, yes. Out. And after that? Out. He was quiet for a moment. Private works that were adjacent to what I'd done before. He set down the thermos. It was specific work for specific clients. Out. She waited. Out. He looked at her in that measured way he had, the one that gave nothing away but did not perform its withholding. He said, I'm not going to explain the whole of it tonight. Out. That's not a denial, she said. Out. No, he said, it isn't. Out. She went back to her office. That evening she ran his name through a professional verification service she had used in competitive intelligence work for clients, Thomas Waverly. The results were correct in the way that curated results are correct. His addresses checked out, his certifications were valid, his employment history was clean and specific, and ended, abruptly, 4 years ago. Before that, 2 security firms, both legitimate. Out. Both with client profiles that, when she mapped them against publicly available contractor disclosures, suggested work at the boundary of what private firms acknowledged doing. Out. She found one of the firms listed in a redacted government subcontractor filing she had obtained through a legal records request during a different piece of work 2 years ago. The firm's known personnel had included 3 individuals identified in the filing as cleared at a level she recognized from a national security consultation Solano Strategic had participated in briefly the previous year. Out. She read the filing again with Thomas Waverly's name in her mind. Out. His employment had stopped 4 years ago. Cora was 8. Out. She did not sleep well that night. Out. The following afternoon she was in her office on a call when she heard the front gate, the specific sound of it. A small resistance and release that she had learned to tune out. What she heard now was different. A single pull, no follow-through. Someone had tested the gate and not come in. Out. The call was still active. She muted herself, moved to the window and saw nothing. But she felt the specific cold of something that was not right, and she had learned over 20 years of reading rooms to respect that feeling. Out. She unmuted herself and finished the call. Out. Thomas was in the walkway when she came through. He was already turned toward the front of the property. Out. Someone just tested the front gate, she said. Out. I know, he said. I saw him. Same build as the man in the photograph your father showed you. He's been on this block twice before. Different approaches each time. Out. How long have you been tracking this? Out. Since day 2, he said. I didn't want to alarm you before I had a pattern. Out. She looked at him. She was a woman who had spent 20 years being the most informed person in her professional environment, and she did not like the feeling of having been the last to know something in her own home, even if the reason was logical. Out. Who are you, she said, not what's in the file. Out. He held her gaze. Someone doing the job your father asked me to do. Out. That's not an answer. Out. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, it's the most honest answer I can give you right now without crossing a line that isn't mine to cross. Ask your father. Out. She called her father that evening. Edward answered on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting the call. Out. He told her enough. Not everything, but enough. Thomas Waverly had come to Edward through a contact, a former colleague from a city infrastructure project who had spent 30 years adjacent to federal contract work. Thomas had done protective work at the intelligence level, the kind that did not appear in public records. Out. He had left the work 4 years ago when Cora's mother died in a situation that Edward described only as a workplace accident, the kind that did not get reported in standard ways. Cora had been 4 years old. Out. He had handed in his credentials 6 weeks after that and had not gone back. Out. Edward had not hired a security contractor. He had found through channels she could not map the specific person he believed his daughter actually needed. Out. Renata sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after the call ended. Out. She thought about Thomas Waverly sitting in that truck on a Wednesday evening, with a daughter in the passenger seat reading a book with a flashlight, one duffel bag, a toolbox, and a quilt. She thought about a man who had operated at the highest level of a particular kind of work and had walked away from it for a 4-year-old. She thought about all the things he had been doing quietly, in the background of her life, that she had not seen because she had not been looking. Out. She had spent 6 days treating him as an imposition. Out. He had spent 6 days keeping her safe without announcement. Out. The threat from Frank Brower moved from background to foreground on a Friday. Renata was working at her desk when her attorney called with news that Brower had filed a civil nuisance complaint against her firm, a frivolous filing designed not to win but to generate procedural noise and attorney hours. It was also, her attorney noted, the kind of filing that preceded escalation in cases she had seen before. Out. 20 minutes after the call, Thomas came into her office through the walkway door for the first time without knocking. He knocked once while opening, which was not the same as waiting. Out. Your attorney just called you, he said. Out. Yes. Out. I know about the filing. I've been tracking Brower's legal activity. He paused. He's also retained a second firm in the past 3 weeks, different from the intelligence firm. This one handles what I'd describe as private pressure. Out. She looked up. How do you know that? Out. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Out. She thought about what private pressure meant in practical terms. She thought about the man who had tested her gate, and the car that had followed them to the hotel, and the photograph of the man in the parking lot 2 Tuesdays in a row. Out. What is he building toward? She said. Out. I don't think he wants to hurt you, Thomas said. I think he wants to make you retract the recommendation. He wants your professional credibility damaged enough that you'll settle to stop the noise. Out. He's going to be disappointed, she said. Out. I know, Thomas said. That's what I'm concerned about. Out. There was a pause in the room that had a different quality from the silences she had grown accustomed to from him. This one had an edge. Out. He's not rational about this, Thomas continued. Rational people calculate risk. He's moved past that. That makes the next step harder to predict. Out. She absorbed this. She was a woman who dealt in analysis, and she knew exactly what harder to predict meant in practice. It meant the standard countermeasures did not fully apply. Out. I need to know everything you know about his pattern, she said. All of it. We work on this together. Out. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, all right. Out. That evening they sat across from each other at her kitchen table for 2 hours. She brought the business documentation. He brought the surveillance pattern he had been tracking quietly for 8 days. Together they built a picture that was more complete than either of them had assembled alone. She knew where Brower's financial pressure points were, and what the civil filing was designed to accomplish. Out. He knew the operational pattern, the times, the locations, the rotation of the 2 men who had been circling her property and office. Out. It was an efficient 2 hours. She asked precise questions. He gave precise answers. Neither of them wasted the other's time. Out. Cora appeared in the kitchen doorway at 9 o'clock in her pajamas, blinking at the documents spread across the table with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. Out. Thomas sent her back to bed with the quiet economy of a man who has performed this particular negotiation many times and knows exactly how much firmness is required. Cora went, but not before giving Renata a very long look from the doorway, the kind of look that children give when they are deciding something. Out. Renata found out what Cora had decided the following morning. Out. She was in the walkway kitchen at 7, earlier than usual, and Cora was already up, sitting at the table with a sheet of paper and a set of colored pencils. When Renata came in, Cora looked up, decided something, and turned the paper around. Out. It was a drawing of 2 people sitting across a table with papers between them. One figure had dark hair and a straight line for a posture that Renata recognized as an 8-year-old's impression of how Renata sat. The other was smaller and lighter and was clearly meant to be Cora herself, though in the drawing she was sitting at the table as if she belonged there. Out. Renata looked at the drawing for a moment. Out. That's us, Cora said, confirming the obvious with the seriousness of someone who wanted to make sure the symbolism landed. Out. I can see that, Renata said. Out. I made you taller, Cora added, which seemed to satisfy some internal requirement. Out. Renata accepted the drawing and propped it against the window ledge near the coffee maker. Cora watched this happen with enormous satisfaction. Thomas appeared in the doorway a moment later, assessed the scene with one quiet look, and said nothing. He poured his coffee and left a second cup on the counter near the window, which was where Renata always stood when she was looking out at the backyard. Out. She drank it. Out. The escalation came on a Saturday evening, earlier than Thomas had expected and in a form that confirmed his concern about unpredictability. Renata was in her home office when her front gate alarm triggered, not the test pull she had heard before, but a full entry. At the same moment, her phone rang from a number she did not recognize. Out. She did not answer it. Out. She was already standing and moving toward the walkway door when Thomas came through from the other side. He did not run. He moved with the particular speed that does not look like running but covers ground at the same rate. Out. Guest unit side, take Cora. Out. She didn't hesitate. This surprised her later when she thought about it. The woman who had spent 20 years not taking instruction from anyone had heard Thomas Waverly's voice and moved without a beat of delay, and the only explanation she could find was that some part of her had already finished evaluating him and arrived at its conclusion without informing her conscious mind. Out. Cora was in the guest unit in her pajamas with a book, and she looked up at Renata with the expression of a child who can read weather in adult faces. Out. We're going to the back room, Renata said. Bring your book. Out. Cora brought her book and her stuffed rabbit, which she had not mentioned and which she apparently kept under the pillow as a precaution. She pressed herself against Renata's side in the back room without being asked, and Renata put an arm around her, which she also did without being asked, and they sat together in the quiet and listened. Out. What happened in the front of the house lasted less than 4 minutes. Out. Renata heard two voices, brief, one of them Thomas, then a sound she could not quite categorize, then silence. Out. Then Thomas's voice close from the other side of the door, clear, you can come out. Out. He had restrained one man in the front garden and managed the second at the gate, both of whom had subsequently been taken into custody by people Thomas apparently had on standby, which told Renata something she filed for later about the extent of his remaining network. He was breathing normally, his expression was the same as always. Out. He checked Cora first. He crouched down to her level and looked at her directly and asked if she was okay in the voice he used only with her, the lower, quieter one. Cora said yes, and then put her face briefly against his shoulder, and he held her there for exactly as long as she needed, and then she straightened up and told him she had brought her rabbit, as if this were important tactical information. Out. He told her it absolutely was. Out. He looked at Renata over Cora's head, and the look did not require translation. Out. She told him what she needed to tell him with a single nod. Out. He nodded back. Out. She did not sleep easily that night, and when she gave up at 5 in the morning, she opened her laptop and went back through everything she had gathered about him. The second reading was different. She was no longer looking for the gap between his file and his reality. She already knew that gap existed and roughly what it contained. This time she was reading for the shape of the choice he had made. Out. A man operating at the level she now understood him to have operated at did not leave that work easily. The infrastructure, the network, the particular kind of purpose it provided, those were not things a person walked away from without substantial cost. She had seen enough people attempt major professional reinvention to know how rarely it worked and how much it cost when it did. Out. He had done it for an 8-year-old who now kept a rabbit under her pillow as a precaution, and who had drawn them both at a table as if the arrangement had been hers all along. Out. She sat with that for a while. Out. At 6:15 she heard him in the walkway. She closed her laptop and went out. Out. He looked at her face and understood immediately that she had not slept. She looked at his face and understood equally immediately that he had known she was awake. Out. They stood in the early gray light without speaking for a moment. Out. I know your file is constructed, she said. I know what that looks like, and yours is. I know the firms you worked for operated at the clearance level. I know there's a period before that with nothing in it. Out. He waited. Out. I'm not asking you to explain it, she said. I'm telling you what I know so you understand I'm not operating with incomplete information anymore. Out. He considered this for a moment. Then he said, your father gave me some parameters when I took this job. One of them was that you needed to have space to form your own assessment. He knew that if I told you everything at the start, you'd manage the situation the way you manage everything, from the outside, with full control. He thought you needed to be inside it first. Out. She thought about her father. 70 years old, a structural engineer, a man who identified failure conditions before the visible signs appeared. Out. He wasn't wrong, she said. Out. No, Thomas said, he wasn't. Out. She leaned against the doorframe. Frank Brower will be dealt with. Your contacts are already handling the legal side? Out. They have what they need. Out. She looked at him steadily. You could have done any number of things after you left that work. Why this? Out. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, because the work still matters to me. Keeping people safe, not the machinery of it, not the clearances and the chain of command, but the actual thing itself. He paused. And because Cora needed me to have a reason to be in the world that wasn't just the fear of losing her. Out. Renata looked at him. She was not a person who responded to emotional disclosure with performance. She did not say the soft things people said in these moments. She held what he had said with the actual weight it deserved, and she let it sit there between them where it belonged. Out. I spent 18 years believing that keeping people at a distance was the same as being safe, she said eventually. Out. Thomas looked at her. Those aren't the same thing, he said. No, she said, I'm beginning to understand that. Out. The Frank Brower matter concluded over the following 3 weeks. Thomas's contacts had been building a parallel file on Brower's private pressure campaign since before the escalation, and combined with what Renata's legal team had documented on the professional side, the weight of it was substantial. Brower hired 3 more attorneys. He gave 2 interviews to business media outlets that had the effect of further documenting his behavior rather than rehabilitating it. Out. He ultimately settled in a way that cost him significantly more than a quiet resolution would have, which Renata's attorney described as a foreseeable outcome for a man who had confused noise with leverage. Out. Patrick, the mid-level employee at Brower's firm who had been feeding information about Renata's office schedule to Brower's intelligence contacts, was identified through the access pattern analysis Renata and Thomas had assembled together. He was not a bad person. He was a person under financial pressure who had made a bad decision, and Renata handled it accordingly. She did not enjoy it. She did not perform not enjoying it. She simply did what the situation required and moved forward. Out. She held a meeting with her full team the week after everything was resolved. She stood in front of 31 people and said something she had not planned to say until she was already saying it. She told them that the firm's strength had always come from analytical precision. That remained true. But she had made a consistent error in treating the relational layer of the firm's work as a liability to be managed rather than an asset to be built. She intended to change that. Out. Several people looked surprised. Her office manager, who had been with the firm for 9 years, gave her a look of such restrained satisfaction that Renata had to work slightly to maintain her composure. Out. She considered it a beginning. Out. Edward came to dinner on the Sunday following. He arrived to find Cora at the kitchen table with her colored pencils, and Thomas quietly making coffee in a kitchen that he had learned the geography of over the preceding weeks. Edward absorbed the scene with the studied expression of a man who had arranged something carefully and was observing the outcome with appropriate restraint. Out. He shook Thomas's hand. He kissed his daughter on the top of her head. He accepted the coffee Thomas handed him and said nothing about any of it. Out. At dinner, Renata told her father she understood what he had done and why, and that she did not intend to spend additional energy being angry about it. Edward smiled into his wineglass with the contentment of a man who had been right and is experiencing the moderate satisfaction of watching that become visible. Out. Thomas was not going to stay indefinitely. They both understood this without saying it. The assignment had a structure, and the structure had reached its conclusion, and he was a man who did not mistake presence for permanence. He had a daughter to raise and a life that had been reshaped once already by loss, and that he was still in the process of building into something that was genuinely his. Out. But there was also the undeniable fact of what the past 3 weeks had produced. Not a romance, or not only that, the word felt too small and too practiced for what had actually happened. What had happened was 2 people under real pressure discovering the specific shape of each other, not the surface, the actual shape, and finding that it matched something they had both stopped expecting to find. Out. Renata did not name it before she understood it. She was not someone who named things prematurely. Out. But on a Tuesday evening in early April, she sat on her back patio in the chair that had been moved 8 inches toward the center of the space, with a coffee she hadn't made herself and Cora somewhere inside humming to herself while she drew, and Thomas sitting at the other end of the patio in the quiet way he had that was never empty, always occupied. Out. The sun was going down behind the houses across the back fence. Out. You filled the bird feeder again, he said. Out. Yesterday, she said. Out. He nodded. Out. They were quiet for a while. The city made its early evening sounds around them. Out. She had spent 18 years building a professional life on the premise that exposure was a form of weakness. Thomas Waverly's entire existence was a counter-argument to that premise, not because he had ever said so, but but because he had given up the most protected version of himself for a small girl who kept a rabbit under her pillow, and he was still here, still present, still choosing to be in the world in a way that required him to care about what happened in it. Out. She looked at the back fence and thought about gaps in sightlines and people who quietly fixed them without being asked. Out. I'm not good at this, she said. She did not specify what this meant. She did not need to. Out. I know, Thomas said. Out. She looked at him. Out. I'm not asking you to be good at it, he said. I'm just asking you to not decide it's impossible before you've tried. Out. She looked away. She looked at the bird feeder, which had 3 house sparrows on it and 1 cardinal who was taking up significantly more than its share of the space. Out. That's a reasonable request, she said. Out. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, almost. Out. She drank her coffee and did not say anything else, and neither did he. And the evening moved around them the way evenings do when 2 people have decided, quietly and without announcement, that whatever came next was at least worth finding out. Out. I keep thinking about the bird feeder. That's the detail that stays with me. Not the confrontation in the garden, not the 2 men restrained in the dark. The bird feeder that had been empty for 2 years, and the jar of sunflower seeds left on a counter without a word. Out. That's what real character looks like, I think. Not the dramatic moments, the quiet ones. Out. Renata spent 18 years building walls she called professionalism. And I understand that impulse completely. When someone takes what you've trusted them with and uses it against you, the most logical response in the world is to stop trusting, to make yourself so self-sufficient that no one ever gets close enough to do it again. She wasn't wrong that it kept her safe. She was wrong that safe and protected are the same thing. Out. Thomas could see the difference from the outside. The sight lines, the blind spots, the gaps in the fence she didn't know existed, because he had spent years learning to look for exactly those things. But Renata couldn't see her own gaps because she had been inside the walls too long. Out. That's the thing about genuine intelligence, and I mean the kind that actually serves you in a life, not just a boardroom. It requires you to apply the same rigor to yourself that you apply to everything else. Renata was brilliant at analyzing external risk. She had built an entire career on it. But she had a category error in her personal operating system, the belief that emotional exposure and professional vulnerability were the same thing. They are not. Thomas proved that simply by existing. Out. By being a man who had operated at the highest level of protective intelligence and had still chosen without hesitation to be soft with an 8-year-old girl. That combination, the capability and the tenderness, was not a contradiction. It was the point. Out. And Thomas. I think about what it cost him to step back into the world after losing Cora's mother. That kind of grief doesn't ask your permission. It just takes up residence. What I respect is that he didn't use it as a reason to stop. He used it as a reason to choose more carefully. That's what I'd call real strength. Not the kind that never breaks, but the kind that breaks and then decides deliberately what to rebuild and why. He rebuilt toward Cora. Out. And then quietly toward something he hadn't planned on. Out. What happened between them followed a logic that I think is simple once you see it. You act with integrity, you show up, you do the job, you fix the blind spots without making it about yourself, and people who are honest enough to pay attention eventually notice. Renata noticed. She didn't perform the noticing, she just adjusted the way a precise instrument adjusts when it's given accurate data. That's who she was, and that was enough. Out. I think the story that stays with me is Cora handing Renata that drawing. 2 figures at a table with papers between them, one of them drawn taller than she was in real life. A child had decided that Renata belonged in the picture. Children are not sentimental. They don't include people in their drawings as a courtesy. Cora included her because something in those 2 weeks had registered as true. Out. That's the only metric that actually matters in the end. Not the professional record, not the controlled image, not the walls. Whether a child who reads rooms the way her father taught her, by necessity, by survival, looks at you and decides you're safe enough to draw. Out. Renata filled the bird feeder. It's a small thing, but it was the first thing she did for someone else without calculating the return. And I think that's where it actually started.